You probably don't think much about the way you can't throw anything away that might still be useful someday. Or how you feel genuinely uncomfortable when someone offers to help you with something you can clearly handle yourself. These aren't just habits. They're not about being frugal or independent or stubborn. There's something deeper. If you grew up in the 1960s, there's a particular psychological blueprint you're operating from. And it shows up in ways so automatic you've stopped questioning them. You were sent outside to play, and the only instruction was to be back when the streetlights came on. No one checked on you. No one called to see where you were. You could be 3 blocks away, or at the park, or in someone's backyard, and your parents wouldn't know and wouldn't ask. This felt like freedom. It felt like trust. And in some ways it was. But it was also something else. It was a very clear message about how much attention you could expect. About how much of their day would be organized around your needs. You learned to entertain yourself because no one was coming to entertain you. You learned to solve your own problems because interrupting an adult with something that wasn't an emergency meant being dismissed. You learned that your presence was tolerated as long as you weren't disruptive, weren't needy, weren't demanding too much attention. And here's the complicated part. That independence you developed was real. It made you capable, self-sufficient, able to handle things on your own. But it also taught you that asking for help was inconvenient. That needing people made you a burden. That the safest way to exist was to manage everything yourself and only show up when you had yourself together. You weren't neglected in the way we think about neglect now. You were fed, housed, clothed. But emotionally, you were often alone. And you learned to be okay with that because you didn't have another option. Now, as an adult, you might notice how hard it is to ask for support. How you'll struggle with something for hours before admitting you need help. How you feel guilty when people go out of their way for you. How you've built an entire identity around not needing anyone. You learned something about your place in the world, and it stuck. There were things boys did and things girls did, and no one questioned it. Boys didn't cry. Boys were tough, competitive, strong. If you showed fear or sadness or tenderness, you were told to man up, to stop being a baby, to toughen up. Girls were helpful. They were nurturing, polite, accommodating. If you were loud or assertive or took up space, you were bossy, unladylike, too much. These weren't suggestions. They were the rules. And you absorbed them, so young that they felt like truth rather than construction. If you were a boy, you learned to suppress whole parts of yourself. Gentleness became weakness. Affection became suspicious. Emotional expression became something you locked away so completely that eventually you couldn't access it even when you wanted to. You became comfortable with anger because that was allowed, but everything underneath it, the hurt and fear and longing, those had nowhere to go. If you were a girl, you learned that your job was to make other people comfortable, to be pleasant, to not cause problems. Your own needs came second, always. Your anger wasn't allowed. Your ambition had to be softened, apologized for, made smaller so it didn't threaten anyone. And the cruelest part is that you internalized this. You started to police yourself. You didn't need anyone to tell you to stop crying or be nicer. You told yourself. You shaped yourself into the acceptable version before anyone had to correct you. And now, decades later, you're still performing it. Still editing yourself to fit a script you didn't write and don't even agree with. Still feeling guilty when you step outside those lines, even though you know intellectually that they're arbitrary. Psychology now recognizes how early this becomes who you think you are. You spent hours alone, and you had to figure out what to do with that time. There was no screen to stare at, no constant stimulation, no device that could deliver infinite content directly into your hands. So you made things up. You built forts and imaginary worlds. You had entire conversations with yourself. You created games with elaborate rules that only you understood. And this wasn't remarkable. This was just childhood. But what it did was train your brain in a very specific way. You became incredibly good at generating your own engagement, at finding something interesting in nothing, at staying occupied without external input. And that capacity for imagination, for self-direction, for internal richness, that's real. It's valuable. But it also came with something else. It came with the belief that you should always be doing something, that idleness is wrong, that if you're not productive, not engaged, not busy, then you're wasting time. You never learned how to just be, how to sit with boredom without immediately trying to fix it, how to exist without a project or a purpose, because your entire childhood trained you to fill empty space, to create when there was nothing. And now, as an adult, you might notice that you can't relax. That downtime makes you anxious. That even on vacation, you're planning, organizing, finding things to do. That sitting still feels like failure. You've carried forward the resourcefulness, but you've also carried forward the discomfort with stillness. The inability to let yourself simply exist without producing something. Most people never notice what this does over time. You played with things that would horrify parents today. Lawn darts that were essentially weighted spears thrown across the yard. Chemistry sets with actual chemicals. Tools that were sharp and real. You rode bikes without helmets, played in construction sites, explored places you weren't supposed to be. And when you got hurt, which you did, the response wasn't panic. It was clean it up, put a bandage on it, don't do that again. You learned through consequence. Through actually experiencing what happened when you misjudged a jump or touched something hot or went too far. And that created a very specific kind of resilience. You developed real risk assessment. Not theoretical, not from being told, but from living it. You learned your own limits by finding them. But here's what that also did. It created a generation that either swung hard in the opposite direction or stayed exactly where they were. Some of you became hyperprotective parents, unable to let your own children experience even minor risks because you remember too clearly what could happen. Every playground becomes a danger zone. Every independence milestone feels terrifying. You're parenting from fear because you know how much can go wrong. Others went the opposite way. You look at modern parenting and think it's absurd. Helicopter parents bubble wrapping children, eliminating all risk. You think kids today are soft because they're not being exposed to the same things you were. And you might be dismissive of concerns that feel overblown to you. Both responses come from the same place. From a childhood where risk was normal and supervision was minimal and you just had to figure it out. It doesn't feel important in the moment. That's why it lasts. No one talked about feelings in your house. Not really. Things happened, and you dealt with them, and then you moved on. If you were upset, you were told to get over it. If you were struggling, you were told it could be worse. There was no sitting down to process. No conversations about what you were experiencing internally. No validation of difficult emotions. You just pushed through. And if you couldn't push through, if something was actually wrong in a way you couldn't ignore, there still wasn't language for it. People didn't go to therapy. Depression was weakness. Anxiety was nervousness. Trauma was something that happened to other people, in wars, not in regular suburban homes. So you learned to suffer quietly, to handle things on your own, to never admit when you were drowning because admitting it meant you were failing at something everyone else seemed to manage just fine. And you got very good at it, at appearing fine when you weren't, at functioning through things that should have stopped you, at building a wall between what you felt and what you showed. But that wall didn't protect you the way you thought it would. It isolated you. It made connection harder. It meant that even now, when someone asks how you are, your automatic response is fine, even when it's not true. Even when you desperately need to talk about what's actually happening. You don't have the vocabulary. You were never given it. And learning it now, as an adult, feels like speaking a foreign language. Therapy feels self-indulgent. Talking about your feelings feels dramatic. Admitting you're struggling feels like failure. Because somewhere deep inside, you still believe that you should be able to handle this on your own. That needing help with emotional things means you're weak. This is where that wall quietly builds. There was a version of you that existed for other people. The one who wore the good clothes on Sunday. The one who sat still in church. The one who said please and thank you and didn't speak unless spoken to when adults were around. That version was polite, well-behaved, presentable. And then there was the version of you that existed at home, in private, when no one was watching. Those two versions were often very different. You learned early that who you really were wasn't always acceptable, that there was a performance required for public consumption. And you got good at it. You knew how to switch, how to pull yourself together, how to be the version that reflected well on your family. Because that mattered. What people thought mattered. And you were an extension of your parents' reputation, so you learned to manage yourself accordingly. But here's what happens when you spend your childhood switching between versions of yourself. You lose track of which one is real. You start to believe that authenticity is something for private moments, and everything else requires a mask. And that's exhausting. It means you're constantly monitoring, constantly adjusting, constantly aware of how you're being perceived and whether you're doing it right. You have a work self and a home self and a friend self and a family self, and they're all slightly different, and you're never quite sure which one is actually you. And the cost of that is connection, because people can't really know you if you're always performing. Even the people closest to you are only seeing the version you've decided is appropriate for them. We've since learned what it costs to split yourself this way. Physical discipline wasn't abuse. It was parenting. You got spanked, and it wasn't questioned. It was expected. Your parents were spanked, their parents were spanked, and you'd probably spank your own kids. It was just how you taught children right from wrong. And it worked in a sense. You learned to behave. You learned quickly what the consequences were for stepping out of line. But you also learned something else. You learned that love and pain could come from the same hand. That the people who were supposed to protect you were also the people who hurt you, and you weren't allowed to be angry about it. You learned that fear was an effective motivator, that your body wasn't entirely your own, that compliance was more important than understanding. And here's the part that no one talked about then, and most people still don't want to talk about now. Your body remembers. Even when your mind has rationalized it, even when you've told yourself it wasn't that bad, even when you've decided it didn't affect you, your body holds it. You might flinch at sudden movements. You might have a complicated relationship with anger, either terrified of it or unable to control it. You might shut down when someone raises their voice because some part of you is still that child bracing for impact. And your relationship with authority is colored by it too. Either you're overly compliant, unable to stand up for yourself when you should, or you're deeply resistant, reacting to any perceived control with disproportionate defensiveness. It's not conscious. It's not a choice you're making. It's the imprint of a childhood where physical punishment was normal. Only later did researchers understand what the body holds. You ate what was put in front of you. There were no alternatives. No catering to preferences. If you didn't like it, you went hungry, or you sat there until you finished it, even if it took hours. Your job was to be grateful, not to have opinions. And it wasn't just about food. It was about learning that your preferences didn't matter as much as the smooth functioning of the household. That making things difficult by having needs or wants was inconvenient. That the right thing to do was adapt, comply, make yourself smaller so everyone else could be comfortable. You learned that keeping the peace was more important than asserting yourself. That causing conflict, even by simply stating what you wanted, was selfish. And you internalized that deeply. You became someone who goes along, who says, "I don't care," when asked what you want because it feels safer than stating a preference and risking disappointment or being seen as difficult. Who prioritizes other people's comfort over your own needs so automatically that you don't even notice you're doing it anymore. And now, as an adult, boundaries feel impossible. Saying no feels mean. Asking for what you want feels selfish. You've built an entire relational style around being easy, being flexible, being low maintenance. And people might even praise you for it. But underneath, there's resentment. There's exhaustion. There's a version of you that never gets to show up because you learned a long time ago that she wasn't welcome at the table. This is where you learned your wants don't matter as much as keeping peace. You were constantly measured against someone else. Your sibling who got better grades. the neighbor kid who was more athletic, your cousin who was more well-behaved. Every achievement was contextualized by how you stacked up, and the praise you received wasn't about you. It was about you in relation to someone else. You weren't smart, you were smarter than your brother. You weren't good at piano, you were better than the other kids in your class. Your worth became entirely external, entirely comparative. You never developed an internal sense of what was good enough because the target was always moving, always dependent on what everyone else was doing. And this created a very specific kind of anxiety. You learned that being good at something wasn't enough. You had to be better. You had to win. Because second place was just first loser. And that made everything a competition, even when it didn't need to be. Even now, you might catch yourself doing it, comparing your career to your friends, your house to your neighbors, your children's achievements to other people's children. You can't just be happy with what you have, because somewhere in your mind, there's always the question of how it measures up. And it's exhausting. It means you're never enough. No matter what you accomplish, someone else has accomplished more. No matter what you have, someone else has something better. And underneath all of that comparison is the belief that your value is conditional, that you have to earn it, that who you are fundamentally isn't enough on its own. Most people don't realize they're still measuring themselves this way. So maybe now those things make more sense. The discomfort with throwing things away, the resistance to asking for help, the automatic, I'm fine even when you're not. These weren't random. They weren't genetic. They weren't just your personality emerging naturally. They were taught, carefully, consistently, through 1,000 small moments that you didn't recognize as formative at the time. You were shaped by a very specific kind of childhood, one where independence was survival, where gender roles were rigid, where emotions were private and expression was dangerous, where discipline was physical and preferences were inconvenient, where your worth was always comparative and authenticity was something you performed. And those lessons didn't evaporate when you turned 18. They're still here, in the way you show up in relationships, in the way you handle conflict, in the way you talk to yourself when you make a mistake, in the way you measure success and define failure. This isn't about assigning blame. The people who raised you were doing what they knew. They were passing down what they'd received. And you survived it. You became capable, resilient, strong in ways that matter deeply. But you also carry things that don't serve you anymore. Patterns that made sense once, and now just create distance. Beliefs about yourself that were never actually true. And maybe seeing that clearly is enough for now. Not to fix everything. Not to go back and rewrite it. Just to understand that the way you are makes sense. That it came from somewhere real. That it meant something. You carry the 1960s inside you, not as nostalgia or memory, but as wiring. As the foundation everything else was built on. And maybe understanding that changes how you see yourself.